What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 220. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to cover on today's show, but of course, the most important news and what I'm really focusing on is the U.S. Russian relationship and the very heightened tensions right now over Ukraine. So I'll be breaking down the recent talks between the Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister and everything going on U.S. Russian relationship. So this will be a very important show to share because this is now breaking into the mainstream media. This was all over the Sunday talk shows today, and it's all U.S. mainstream media establishment blob spin. It's all Russia bad, Russian aggression. What can we do to help the Ukrainians from Russia? And I'll put in the actual context on today's show. So please take the time to share this episode. I think it'll be a very important one to put out there and for people to listen to. It's at the Libertarian Institute, where I'm the news editor and also write the news roundup. So check out the Institute. Also, you can find the show video version on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. And then it's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts, and often appears in the blog section at antiwar.com. You can donate to the show to help the show grow even more. Patreon, Subscribestar, and crypto information are all in the show notes page. So please go over to the Institute, check that out, and donate to the show if you can. You can also help out the show by doing your CBD shopping at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. They have a great selection of high-quality products at Paloma Verde. Lab tester results right there on their website. My personal favorite is the topical, the sports cream. Love the smell, works fast, lasts a long time. But they have tons of other great products. When the co-host Connor Freeman is here, he's always talking about how he likes the soft gels and the gummies. So whatever you got going on, probably something that can help you at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The best thing is that you get a discount. Spend $75 or more. Use the promo code PEACE. That saves you 25%. But even better, it also gets the show a kickback. And so, we get paid when you do your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde. And so it's an absolutely great way to help yourself and help out the show. All right, now let's get into the episode. First story here is Ukraine now says that Russia was behind a recent cyber attack. The attack, at least when it happened, was claiming that information and data was stolen. I have no idea how significant it is. Microsoft, who I guess, contracts and has various things going on with the Ukrainian government. I'm not sure if it was actually Microsoft systems that were hacked here or not, says that it could be worse than feared. And again, as expected, Ukraine is blaming Russia for this attack, but there is no actual evidence presented here. And so while they say, oh yeah, there's evidence that points to a Russian attack, unless you actually get that from the Ukrainian government, I would be highly, highly skeptical that that's the case. And, it's not absolutely impossible that Russia would carry out a cyber attack against Ukraine, although, maybe something that had a little bit more directed at the military or something like that. It's not exactly clear of what Russia would gain by carrying out this attack. Now, one of the important reasons that Ukraine blaming NATO is drastically important here is because NATO has already said that, cyber attacks on NATO member states could trigger Article 5 and, the mutual defense treaty and everything like that, and could be treated as an attack on NATO by carrying out a cyber attack. And also, NATO is signing in this from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, January 18, 2022. NATO signs deal with Ukraine to deepen cyber cooperation. On Monday, NATO signed a deal with Ukraine to boost cyber cooperation amid simmering tensions with Russia. Ukraine and NATO first signed a technology-related agreement in 2015, and cooperation has increased over the years. The new deal aims to help Ukraine's military modernize its information and technology and communication services. Yeah, and so that's the important thing is, that we're signing deals and that the cyber deals are military related. And so, Russia, who opposes the West and NATO deepening security ties with Ukraine, is definitely going to be opposed to the U.S. and the Western countries and NATO deepening the cyber security and, especially along the defensive, which, really just means war and military. It's not, the defense is one of those fancy Orwellian words where now, you're building new, like, hypersonic missiles and things like that, and you say it's a part of the defense budget. Obviously, these things are just for war. They're just, for carrying nuclear weapons and killing people and everything like that. But, the word defense just gets thrown around, right? And so with, us giving them more cyber capabilities, this could these cyber attacks on Ukraine could even be, Russia trying to push back or fight back against something like that. And so, actually, I was going to talk about this later in the show, but it may be worth it to just bring it up now. That last year, the Pentagon said that its new cyber operation task force, this one, a U.S. Cyber Command Task Force, conducted its first cyber offensive operation in 2021. So this happened sometime last year, according to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. This Cyber Command Task Force had never gone on the offensive before, and this task force is made up of military personnel from the Air National Guard, Air Force, and Navy. And so, we really could be seeing, and obviously, if NATO is going to treat a cyber attack as potentially invoking Article 5 and all of that, this being a very serious situation we're getting into where, the battlefield is being played out in the cyber arena, and yet it could cost very real human lives when we're all done with it. And so something to really keep our eye on. Now, another story going on in Ukraine that's very interesting is the feud and the charges against the former Ukrainian president Petro Poroshenko, who was the head of Ukraine's government between 2014 and 2019. So he was the first post-coup, or I guess not first, because I think there was, like a immediately installed government, but the first elected government post-U.S. coup in Ukraine was headed by Poroshenko. And so I think the assumption was, including by myself, is that this guy is an American bad puppet, and Zelensky certainly acts a hell of a lot like an American bad puppet. And so it's kind of confusing as to how the geopolitics are playing out here, or if it's really not a geopolitical situation at all, and this just has far more to do with Ukrainian power competition and Poroshenko trying to, get more power or something like that back. He was outside of Ukraine, I believe in Poland, when these charges were announced. And it says that the charges are for treason linked to financing of Russian-backed separatist fighters through illegal coal sales in 2014 and 2015, which again is very concerning, or I guess questionable, I would say, because during this time, Poroshenko was the president of Ukraine at war with these Russian-backed separatists. And so maybe there's a little bit of a situation being exploited here by the Zelensky government, the current Ukrainian government, as like maybe Poroshenko was just buying the coal because they really needed it, and that's where the current supply chains were, and so didn't really want to buy it from the enemy, but even worse, sometimes you got to, or maybe there was something more nefarious going on here. It just would really surprise me if it were the case that Poroshenko was going out of his way to bat the Russian separatists here. And my gut is telling me, not my gut, just everything I'm reading here says that this may not be like a U.S. is, the Zelensky is the U.S. bad guy right now. Him going after Poroshenko may have nothing to do with Poroshenko's relationship with Russia. And I think that's the case. But I will keep an eye on this, and it could, I think, turn out to be very important. Poroshenko faces 15 years if he's convicted for this. And so while, treason and certainly 15 years isn't like insignificant or anything, but we're not talking about a death penalty or anything like that. Now, the U.S. is continuing to warn that Russia could invade Ukraine at any time. And as me and Dave Camp discussed on the last episode of the show, who this article here is written by, very interesting that you have Blinken traveling to, Kiev and Ukraine, and then meeting with the Russian foreign minister again, him being in Ukraine, as he's warning that Russia could invade at any time. The State Department also announced that the U.S. was charging 4 Belarusian officials with aircraft piracy over the downing of, not downing, I guess that's the wrong word, forced landing of a plane that was carrying I believe, Ukrainian, I don't want to call him a journalist because I think he's associated with the Azov guys and everything like that. Certainly not a sympathetic character or anything like that. But, they did force this plane to land to arrest this person who was a blogger, again, for, I believe, nationalist, ethno-nationalist elements in Ukraine. So certainly, again, not a super sympathetic figure. But the U.S. doing this, there's a lot of hypocrisy in it, of course, because, we force like the Bolivian, right? Evo Morales' plane down years ago because we thought that Julian Assange could possibly be on it and things like that. So, this isn't a unique thing that Belarus did here, but at the same time that, these officials are facing charges now, I don't expect, I guess, any of them to travel to the United States and actually go to court over this, but maybe they're going to try to seize assets or something like that with these charges. The U.S. announced, and this was on Secretary of State Antony Blinken's Twitter, that the U.S. was sanctioning 4 individuals connected with ongoing Russian-directed influence activities to destabilize Ukraine. I think this is far less a matter of actual Russian disinformation attempts or anything that Russia is doing in Ukraine, but the U.S. trying to back its puppet forces in Ukraine to help out the politicians in Ukraine that are loyal to the U.S. If you sanction all the opposition, especially in a country like Ukraine that has so many ties with the West, all the sanctioned politicians are going to be severely limited by those sanctions. And so I think that may be what's going on here. There's a new bill introduced in the Senate, and what a collection of ugly characters that put forward this bill. It's John Cornyn, Cardin, Wickers, Shaheen, Graham, and Blumenthal, some of the worst Russia hots that we have. And this new bill, this is Orwellian to the extreme at the Hill. Senators introduced bill aimed at protecting Ukrainian civilians. Really, what this bill is going to do is make it easier for the Biden administration to give weapons to Ukraine, a severely corrupt state, a state with, extremist elements, white nationalist elements within its own military. But we're going to give these people weapons, apparently, to protect the people of Ukraine. This is absolutely insane and absurd. But yet, this is what the U.S. government continues to do. And my guess is that the Biden administration may not be particularly thrilled with this bill initially, because there's one more important note in the bill, and that says that a cyber attack would be treated as any other attack, like a physical attack, with a tank or something like that. And so that could kind of tie the Biden administration's hands. So there may be parts of this bill that they're not particularly thrilled about, but I'm guessing that they won't complain too much if this thing actually does start to move forward. And so, we're giving weapons to the Ukraine all the time as is, but they really, really want to ramp it up here and give even more weapons to Ukraine. And this is just the absurd situation that we have in the United States right now, where the Biden administration is extremely hawkish on the Ukraine issue, and bipartisan, Senate coalitions are put together to be marginally more hawkish than the Biden administration on this issue, to the point where, it makes it very hard to engage in diplomacy for the Biden administration and walk back from the brink that they've already found themselves in with their own aggression. It's just such a hard thing to try to combat when you have the Hawks, so deep in every level of the government and all constantly trying to outdo each other. It's not enough that we're giving billions of dollars in lethal aid to the Ukrainians. The only real, I guess, yeah, let's get into this part next. Germany has rejected calls to send weapons to Ukraine, and this is really one of the first states, and I guess France too, to maybe put up a little bit of I don't know how much we want to do this whole war over Ukraine situation where the US and the UK really, really seem to be interested in this. In fact, the German Chancellor turned down a request from Joe Biden to discuss the Ukraine crisis, which I'm not sure how often the Ukrainian Chancellor, the new Ukrainian Chancellor, by the way, is Olaf Scholz, who replaced Merkel a couple months ago, so it's no longer Merkel. But I'm not sure how often it is that the Ukrainian chancellor turns down conversations with the American president, but the fact that this ends up being leaked to the media. Now, they did, put some qualifications in there. Oh, it was a short notice call and things like that. And the chancellor was really busy. But, the fact that he didn't just say, okay, I'll take do the call at the end of the day, or, we scheduled a call for 2 or 3 days later, suggests to me that Ukraine is actually Germany is actually pretty unhappy with the U.S.'s position on Ukraine. And we also had the CIA Director William Burns visit Ukraine and Germany after Germany rejected distributing more weapons to Ukraine. And interesting is that part of the reason that Burns went to Ukraine, and this is from a source within the U.S. government, they said and reported at the Wall Street Journal that the reason was Germany won't commit to sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 should Russia invade Ukraine. And so we are starting to see a little bit of daylight between the U.S. and some of our European partners, which brings me to these two articles that I want to discuss. One from Joe Loria at Consortium News, absolutely fantastic, titled Ukraine Crisis, German Navy Chief Resigns, Britain spreads fear of Russian coup and wider war. Loria hits on a lot of news in this article, but the most important point he's making here is that the Germans do not have the same appetite for, one, defending the Ukrainians, and two, conflict with Russia, and three, sanctioning Russia as the Americans and the British do. And so this is very important because the way NATO is structured is that, countries do have veto positions and everything like that. And, could say that Ukraine isn't going to join NATO. And so, as Anatole Levine points out in his great article at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft titled How Emmanuel Macron Can End the Threat of War in Europe, he's talking about how the French could do this as well, but putting something in writing for the Russians to say that, our state, whether this is, again, the German or the French, our state will not support a Ukrainian membership into NATO could absolutely be huge at diffusing the conflict. Now, there's a lot of other stuff going on here, and while it would certainly take the foot well off the gas and start to lean it on the brake, you do, I guess, have the issue that even if these two European powers openly denounce the American position of, Ukraine's going to join NATO and everything like that, and to be more against arming and backing Ukraine and supporting this insane policy that's leading towards war with Russia, if the U.S., just refuses and says, okay, Germany, you're not going to let Ukraine into NATO. We're just going to, give them de facto membership and treat them like members in every way. And, maybe we won't put a mutual defense treaty in writing with Ukraine, but we'll, continue to give them security promises and all that. And, that offset by the United States, even if Germany and France do really push back against NATO membership, I guess may not be quite enough. But as Loria and Levine point out there, that, or Levin, I think, sorry, that this could really be a situation where the European states, especially like the big powerful ones like France and Germany, have the ability to whop at the American position. So while those two states, again, Germany and France, don't seem interested in very much aggression against Russia, particularly over Ukraine, that has not stopped a lot of the other European powers from going along. The UK is pushing this idea that Russia is attempting to carry out a coup in Ukraine. I guess the guy that they're saying Russia is going to put in charge is Yevhen Muraliv. And I mean, I don't know anything about this guy. It's absolutely possible that he ends up being in charge of Ukraine one day. Maybe it's because of support he gets from Russia. Doesn't seem like there's anything going on the ground right now to suggest that. And unlike in 2014, when the U.S. was plotting a coup in Ukraine, the Russians produced evidence. I think it's very much believed to be the Russians that produced the evidence of the phone call between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt, who are now both again in the Biden administration, but then as members of the Obama administration were on a call planning, a coup in Ukraine. Who's going to take over the leadership and everything like that. And in that case, it actually ended up the people they said ended up being the coup leaders, and the coup followed the exact formula that Victoria Nuland had laid out in that call, and it doesn't seem like the UK has that kind of evidence to point the finger at Russia. So I remain very skeptical that that's actually the case. We also have Spain participating in the U.S. Build up an aggression towards Russia, with Spain now planning to send warships into the Black Sea and is considering sending warplanes into the region. I'm sure that there's nothing particularly significant about the Spanish deployment here, except that it is kind of seeming to build a coalition of the willing type of situation for the Biden administration, where when you say, oh yeah, the Polish, the Baltic states, Romania, all these countries, Spain, the UK, are on board with what we're doing in Ukraine. And so it gives it a sense of legitimacy that it absolutely shouldn't have. Let's see. So Russia is now planning some massive naval war games. They're going to, over the next, I guess, 6 weeks, they said through the end of February, and they announced this on the 20th, so about 6 weeks' time. Russia announced on Thursday the deployment over 140 combat and supply ships, over 50 aircraft, 1,000 pieces of military equipment, and 10,000 military servicemen. The Russian Defense Ministry said the Russian Navy will have a series of exercises in all zones of responsibility from January to February. In accordance with the plan for training the Russian armed forces in 2022, a series of naval exercises will be held in January and February in all fields of zones of fleet's responsibility under the general guidance of the Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Navy. The exercises will encompass seas washing Russia's and also world oceans of key importance. There will be some exercises in the Mediterranean and northern seas, and in the Sea of Okhotsk in the northern Atlantic and Pacific. So I guess nothing specifically about the Black Sea, but I do somewhat expect there to be some Russian ships in the Black Sea as well. Now, of course, in the West, this is going to be portrayed as Russian aggression, but I think this is a very calculated move by Russia, by Putin. And the idea here is to show the West how absolutely intolerable that these war games going on in and around their waters all the time are. And maybe that would help create a reason for the West to want to negotiate on these war games. So if, putting warships in the northern Atlantic is something that really, really upsets the UK and Canada and the US, maybe they would be willing to have a deal where there's less Russian warships there, and in exchange there's less US warships in the Black Sea or something like that. And so my guess is that's kind of the strategy that Russia is playing here, because they've made similar statements on deployments to, say, Cuba or Venezuela, where these are states clearly in the American sphere of interest, and the U.S. would obviously be very upset if Russia deployed a large number of troops to either of these countries. I think the point that Russia would try to be made by that is not we're some growing power that's going to put troops on your border, but rather see how intolerable it is when we're putting troops in Cuba. This is like you putting troops in Ukraine or Belarus, or not Belarus, Bulgaria or the Baltic states or Poland or something like that. And so maybe that would, I guess, create the situation for Russia, or at least maybe Putin perceives it as, he would then create the space and the leverage that he needs to have something to negotiate the U.S. troops out of Ukraine or something like that. So I think it's possible that that's kind of the war games and the general Russian strategy going on here. All right, now for the Blinken Lavrov talks that happened in Geneva, and there's a great breakdown on it that we reprinted by Gilbert Dothrow on the blog at antiwar.com, titled Blinken and Lavrov Meet in Geneva, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And he kind of lays out what happened in this meeting and why there were actually some positive notes. And there was an agreement. I believe the U.S. next week is going to present the Russians with a written response to the Russian security proposal that they put forth in the middle of December. And so that will be interesting. Now, I guess according to Dothrow, the agreement was that the U.S. is going to give that to Russia, but Russia is not expected to make the response public. And so my guess is we will know a lot about what the U.S. letter says by the Russian response, but I do mostly expect Russia to hold true on it and actually not release that to the public. Now, Dothrow has some important analysis on that the way that this is being negotiated, and the request there that not become public, one has to wonder if it's because the U.S. is going to come out with an completely intolerable position towards Russia, and they just don't want to be seen as taking such a hard line, or I think, as Dothrow is suggesting here, that the U.S. is actually going to take a position, or could possibly take a position on Ukraine and with Russia here, that could diffuse the situation. However, the Biden administration taking that position would be so intolerable politically in the United States, particularly with the rabid hawks that we have in Congress, that it will actually be a deterrent for that to come out publicly and make it harder for the Biden administration to negotiate. And it is mostly the Republicans that are responsible for that very hawkish attitude in the Senate, at least at this time, now that we're past the Biden years. But the Democrats are really bad on this as well, and there's a lot of Russia hawks in the Democratic Party that are very loud right now. So we had some, again, as Dothrow says, positive steps, things going in the right direction, a potential meeting being floated between Biden and Putin. And then also you had in this meeting the 15 minutes of conversation between Blinken and Lavrov that were not apparently attended by anybody else, assistants or translators. And Dothrow suspects and suggests that those parts of the talks, at least a little bit, were on the Iran issue. And so it could be that we are actually moving forward on the Iran issue and in the right direction there, even if the issue over Ukraine, where these talks were generally centered around, there wasn't any positive steps. Now, essentially, as soon as this gets done, oh, one more thing, and this was in the Lavrov article. I picked this up in Reuters. Blinken called for Russia to release two U.S. citizens that are being held and convicted of crimes in Russia. One is former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, who was convicted on espionage charges. And I gotta say, I've been very suspect of these charges the entire time. Not that the U.S. wouldn't have spies in Russia trying to steal information and things like that. However, this has always seemed a little bit shaky to me, the Russian claims here. And the initial arrest happened around the time that Maria Butina was politically railroaded in the United States and thrown in an American prison. So I had actually initially thought that this was maybe a Russian response to Maria Butina. However, Butina got released a couple years ago from the United States, and Whelan is still held. And so at least it's not playing out as the Canada-China relationship did when this happened. Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Canada on charges related to U.S. sanctions, and China responded by arresting two men named Michael, and then I think they held, kind of took visas and or passports or whatever, and didn't allow some other people to travel out of China who were of Canadian descent. But once Meng was allowed to return to China, then everybody else, to my knowledge, what ends up getting released and everything like that. And so maybe it wasn't that kind of retaliatory move by Russia, and they actually think that either Whelan is guilty of something or they're trying to punish him. Whelan does hold 4 passports, which did seem to be one of the big red flags about him to me. And then there's this other guy who I don't know anything about. I think his name might be Trevor Reed. And again, I don't know anything about his case, but apparently he's an American who's been arrested in Russia. So back to the doctoral article, and then let's talk about the steps in the wrong direction that we have now, which is immediately after the talks, the U.S. announces that more weapons are going to be going to Ukraine. I think those are mainly ammunition. And then Russia, announced or had been moving assets into Belarus. We talked about this on the show with Dave DeCamp. Russia's planning its major war games coming up right now in Belarus, but as a part of those war games, as Datro points out, they moved, I believe, 2 S-400 systems into Belarus. And so if they were trying to maybe look at creating a situation in Ukraine where the Ukrainian aircraft were unable to take on the separatists, then the S-400 systems could be used for that. Then we had the announcement and this from Natasha Bertrand, who one of the worst Russiagators and always hawkish and just rabid against Russia, tweeting out that the White House press secretary Jen Psaki says the administration has notified Congress of the U.S.'s intent to deliver Mi-17 helicopters to Ukraine. These were helicopters that were intended for or a part of the Afghan military, and now we're looking to transfer them to Ukraine. There's a couple level here that these are Soviet weapon systems, and so there's maybe an insult to injury kind of part here on Russia. Not only is the U.S. Army in Ukraine, but doing so with former Soviet weapons may feel kind of insulting towards Russia. Of course, the U.S. giving the Ukrainian government helicopters and Stinger missiles and all these other weapons is somewhat, and I've talked about this in the past on the show, reminiscent of what the U.S. did in Afghanistan, where, maybe they're trying to, they don't care about, they're willing to fight a war in Ukraine because they think what's going to happen is they're going to be able to arm the Ukrainian government to a sufficient amount that, yeah, a lot of Ukrainians are going to die. Yeah, it's going to be bad for the Ukrainian state, but Russia is going to absolutely bleed financially with their own troops in Ukraine. And so it almost seems like they're trying to bait the Russians into like having another Afghan situation. And of course, this is absolutely going to be disastrous. Not only are they giving Ukraine all these weapons, but of course they're training insurgents in Ukraine. And also, people have talked about that article in Yahoo a lot, and it's very important that the U.S. is training these potential, one day insurgents to fight against Russia in Ukraine, but they're training them in the U.S. But in there, the CIA paramilitaries, CIA contractors, militants hired by the U.S. government, it says in that article, are making battlefield gains on the ground in Ukraine. And so America is already fighting a war on the ground in Ukraine. We are paying to fight a war against the Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine right now. And so all the crying and everything that we do about all the Russian support for the separatists and everything like that, understand that people only fighting because they're paid to do so by the United States are fighting on the ground right now in Ukraine. So those are, I think, the major steps in the wrong direction that I've seen are, the weapons that we're going to give Ukraine, and of course the bad news from seemingly bad news from Russia moving the S-400 over. Then today we have apparently the U.S. Embassy in Kiev had asked and then gotten permission to remove some non-essential personnel from its embassy in Ukraine. This is being portrayed in the U.S. media, and maybe rightfully so, as something that the U.S. is doing because it fears that Russian invasion of Ukraine is imminent. It's also possible that this is essentially just trying to generate fear in a story here. And, if we say, oh my God, we have to get our troops out of, our personnel out of the embassy, then that just creates more headlines and everything like that. Now, one last story, a little bit of good news before we wrap up the Russia conversation here, and that is United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken has rebuffed calls to immediately impose sanctions on Russia, saying doing so would undercut the West's ability to deter potential Russian aggression. And so this does show that Blinken kind of understands at least how this is supposed to work, because the sanctions is what the U.S. is threatening will happen to Russia if Russia invades Ukraine. And so, if we say, Russia, we're going to sanction you if you invade Ukraine, and then we put sanctions on Russia before Russia invades Ukraine, what is the deterrent then that the U.S. is exercising to prevent Russia from invading Ukraine? Now, there's, some mainstream blobby narratives that are at work there, but I do think that in some respect that is a true statement that if we go ahead and we do the maximum that we're willing to do over Ukraine to Russia, then it in a way is incentivizing Russia just to go ahead and invade Ukraine, but at the same time, I do think there's going to be some pretty severe costs imposed on Russia for doing so, and that Russia really doesn't want to invade Ukraine if all else could be prevented. But the sanctions is a way of, I think, trying to prevent finding a way out, right? And that's why they're so intent on putting sanctions on Ukraine right now. The other effect, I guess, are on Russia. The other effect that would have is if the U.S. does go ahead and sanction Russia over Ukraine now, well, then they're going to start saying, well, what are you going to do? What are your plans if Russia invades Ukraine? And then they have to come up with new plans. And then those plans are going to be more militaristic because, the economic war is already turned up to 10 and there's nowhere else to go on it. So I don't know, that's part of my suspicion of why they're pushing Biden so hard on the issue right now. And yep. All right, let's move on and talk about Havana Syndrome, which of course has been one, I've really tried to cover it on this show and keep up everything that's going on with Havana, especially after it made its resurgence in the Biden administration. Remember, this was the false big lie that Trump told in 2017 to undo Obama's détente with Cuba. They were claiming that there's these weird things happening, that diplomats are getting headaches, and we have to remove all of our embassy staff from Cuba. They use this to unwind the diplomatic staff, and then they start to put on sanctions and travel restrictions and all of that. And it was all started with this Havana Syndrome nonsense. Immediately, it was rightfully called out as seeming very, very suspicious, and then later proven to have just been crickets that, were probably giving people some headaches. And essentially, there's a lot of like psychosomatic symptoms going on here, and a few other things. And so that's where Havana Syndrome comes from. Now, once Biden takes office, this thing absolutely gets blown up. It's the Russians, it's the Chinese that are carrying out these attacks on Americans. Over 200 diplomats have been attacked all over the world, in Russia, in Hanoi, in Geneva, Paris, London, everywhere that these attacks are going on. And the most recent two alleged attacks, and this was January 13th, were in Geneva and Paris. But then just this past weekend, we got a report, this from Politico: U.S. foe or suspected weapon not behind sustained global campaign causing Havana Syndrome, CIA finds. And the reason that this is so important isn't necessarily because I take the CIA at its word, and if the CIA says there's no Havana Syndrome, well, that means there's no Havana Syndrome. However, the reports of Havana Syndrome are all coming from the government. The rest of the world, and particularly the independent media in the U.S., has all been very skeptical and pushing back against this from years. And so if the own government that's pushing this can't even come out and substantiate the claims, then it becomes even much, much more skeptical to me. And so I think this is actually kind of big that the CIA put this out. Now, it is an interim report, and it kind of says that all the cases that they've examined can be uncovered by or can be explained by a medical, environmental, technical factors, including previously undiagnosed illnesses. Now, there is, I guess, one other kind of important issue here is that this comes from the CIA. Of course, CIA director is William Burns. And when William Burns had previously traveled to Russia, he had raised the Havana Syndrome issue with the Russians. And so it doesn't seem to me that maybe the CIA is just dogmatically against this under the direction of William Burns or anything like that. And so this gives, to me, just a little bit more credibility to this report. Now, it does say that it hasn't looked into every case, and it hasn't completely dismissed, in every case that it could have been some kind of potential microwave or directed energy weapon. But it very clearly says that there's no cases that is even suspected of being the case. Now, if you read the mainstream media over the weekend, all the headlines were written almost to suggest that while in a majority of cases it wasn't another state actor, maybe it was in other cases, which isn't really what the CIA is saying. They're saying they can't prove the negative in the other cases, but they're not even remotely alleging that there's any kind of global campaign going on here. And so this is why I've suspected all along. This is what I've been saying on the show all along. Although I don't rely on the CNN or the CIA to vindicate me or things like that. But again, if the CIA can't even spin a lie out of this, then my strong suspicion is that it doesn't exist. All right, so now I'm going to wrap up the show and doing a segment on the Sahel region of Africa. These are countries Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, parts of Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad, where there's been a large spike in violence following the U.S. war in Libya to overthrow Gaddafi in 2011, first spreading into Mali, but now spreading all over the region. And after the U.S. war in Libya, conflict broke out in Mali, and France got involved. And there's a great episode of this show from the past summer. The great Danny Shergen comes on and explains Mali's role in the French Empire, French colonialism, and all of that, and why, the whole bad story of this war. So I don't want to get into that on today's show because it's like an hour-long conversation that I had with Danny, but please go back and listen to that episode if you're interested. But had this article from the Washington Post titled Biden mulled reducing support for France's military operations in Africa. Instead, it doubled down. And it goes into how the U.S. is operating drones, particularly over Mali, in support of French military operations in the area. Now, the most significant part of this article is that prior to the AUKUS deal, that's the Australia, UK, US agreement, where the US is going to provide nuclear-powered submarine technology to Australia, and then because of that, Australia backed out of a diesel-powered submarine agreement with France, causing frictions between the U.S. and France because this was major costly to the French military-industrial complex. And so after that, the U.S. decides to double down in Africa. Now, let's just talk about the reason that the U.S. is signing the AUKUS agreement, the reason the Biden administration would be moving away as originally intended from the war in the Sahel, from the war in Mali, is because, they envision this great pivot to Asia because we got to confront the rising Chinese dragon and everything like that. But in reality, what is happening here is that the U.S. signing this AUKUS deal and then, the resulting decisions by the Biden administration has further embroiled America in northern and western Africa where it doesn't want to be at all. It's just completely insane how backwards all of America's policies are and how everything ends up blowing up in our face. We have AUKUS that's supposed to be this, great thing for countering China, except now we're more pinned down in Africa than ever before. So that's kind of the situation with the geopolitics here with the U.S. and Africa. Now, to get into Mali a little bit more, this is a country that's had 2 coups in the past 2 years where they've overthrown a government. I don't think it was elected, but civilian leadership government was overthrown by the high-ranking colonels in the military. And after the second coup, the military put out a plan where I think they were going to hold elections in like 5 years. And so I'm not exactly sure even what side of this war France is on, because that military is fighting against the jihadists. France is fighting supposedly against the jihadists, but now a coalition of like 15 West African states, and this is mostly the former French colonies in Africa, have announced sweeping sanctions against Mali because the military leadership there isn't going to hold elections for 5 years. Of course, the people of Mali are very upset about this and launched massive protests, and aid groups are warning that it's going to be an absolute catastrophe because of these sanctions, which, by the way, the European Union is expected to fall in line with on. And so I'm not exactly sure of what exactly France is trying to accomplish in Mali, because it doesn't seem like they even have a real actor that they're backing at this point. In part response to the coups and everything else, and the lack of success in the war, the fact that French soldiers have been killed there, they had announced earlier this year that they were going to unwind the operations a little bit. And so I believe that it has happened to some extent, but in response, the government of Mali, the ruling military coalition there, has basically, used Russian forces. Now, there's I don't think it's questioned that there are Russian forces in northern Mali there helping out the government and everything like that. They say that they're just trainers and that, they're Russian uniformed soldiers. Now, the West says that they are members of the Wagner group, this Russian military paramilitary group or mercenary group. Not quite sure how how significant the deployments are or anything like that. Of course, the West is making a very big deal over it, so I'm just a little bit skeptical of how serious it is. But you know, the government there is backed by Russia at this point, by Russian troops, and so I'm not clear if like France and Russia have found themselves on the same side of another conflict in Africa, and the U.S. is actually by the fact that we're helping the French, that we're now on the sides of the Russian too. I have some real questions about exactly who the hell France is fighting and backing in Mali, and by that that who the U.S. is fighting and backing in Mali. There's a lot of killing going on in Mali, civilians dying all the time, soldiers getting killed. 8 soldiers were killed right at the end of 2021. And then a couple weeks before that, there were actually 7 members of the UN peacekeeping force from Togo. So 7 Togolese forces were killed. And then just today or yesterday in Mali, there was a French soldier who was killed by an attack on France's army base, the one that they have remaining in Mali. And so, and that's in Gao. So a lot going on in Mali, and trying to keep up with it all and break it down in a way that's coherent, where I'm not just repeating what's reported in the Western media and everything like that. 2 more troop kind of announcements going on with Mali. The first is that Chad is going to deploy 1,000 troops to Mali. This is significant in one way because from the perspective of Chad, as this is a country who saw a change in leadership in 2021. The former president Deby was killed and his son took over. It was common for Chad's forces to be used in the Sahel region, under the command of his father, and so it seems that the son is kind of picking up and largely carrying out operations in the same way. And then Sweden is announcing that they're going to withdraw their 400 troops from the French mission to Mali. They have 150 troops there, I guess, just backing France, and then another 250 backing the UN mission to Mali. Although it's France is saying this was always the scheduled plan for Sweden to remove their troops after 2 years, and maybe that's the case, but the mission obviously isn't done, and so Sweden leaving suggests that this isn't going very well, and maybe that these Western countries are running out of allies on the ground. So I think that's what I have on Mali. Very important what's going on there, and of course the conflict there has spread all over. Just to get back and I guess mention one more thing in the Washington Post article, which is mainly promoting it in positive towards the U.S. support for France and Mali. But it does say in there that, critics are saying that the strikes are actually creating more terrorists than they're killing. And that does seem to be the case with how we've seen terrorism spread throughout the region. And so one story on Chad before we move on to some of the rest of the region, and that is the government there, led again by the younger Deby, has decided to release 250 members of armed groups that were against the central government there. And I'm not sure if these are the people that were fighting against the government when his father was killed, or if this is a different group of rebels in Chad, but it is usually signed to try to engage in peace talks and to have some steps in the right direction if you're releasing members of an opposition group. Now, of course, me not understanding Chad all that well, maybe there's something going on here where, you're releasing members of one opposition group to then use them or leverage them against a different opposition group, or, you're keeping more extremist or what you view as more extremist or more prominent elements of the opposition in prison in exchange for releasing maybe people who are a little bit more moderate or less capable or something like that. I don't know how if this is like more of a nefarious and savvy move, or if it's really just an effort to generate peace talks in Chad. Burkina Faso. This is one of the countries south of Mali that has experienced an explosion of violence since the U.S. war in Libya and the French Forever War in Mali. There's a joint coalition of Burkina Faso and forces from Niger that claim that they wiped out, and this was in the middle of December, 100 terrorists. Could be that they killed 100 terrorists, could also be that they killed a good number of civilians in there. And then 41 people were killed in an ambush in Burkina Faso. I think there were quite a few military soldiers that were involved that were also killed. And the violence in Burkina Faso has gotten to the point over the past few months that there's been protests against the government, and the president there, who I think is the main power holder, fired the prime minister. And maybe that was just like kind of a token move to try to alleviate some of the conflict. At the same time, maybe the prime minister was a part of the problem, but it doesn't seem like the situation has gotten all that much better in Burkina Faso. And in fact, as I record today, there are what sounds like pretty solid reports that there are a mutiny of some soldiers in Burkina Faso, and that their main reason that they're upset is because the government isn't giving them the resources that they need to take on the militants, and that the military has lost a lot of soldiers, right? They're dying because the government isn't doing enough against these militants. And so that is reported had to start to mutiny. Now, some people are saying that that's a coup. I'm not quite sure exactly what's happening on the ground in Burkina Faso here, but definitely something that I will keep my eye on. And if there is a coup, talk about more in the coming days. Again, there are reports too that seem somewhat accurate that people have heard gunfire. Hundreds of people have been killed in and around Nigeria and Niger over the past couple of months, and this is the violence spreading to those countries as well. I don't always talk about and break down all the times that there's these massacres of 20, 30, 50 people in these various countries, in part because a lot of the times the only reporting that you get, especially in Western media, is men on motorbikes showed up with guns and burned down a village and killed 50 people, which may have happened, may not have. I don't know. I'm guessing that again, there's a good amount of violence going on, and maybe the body counts are right, but actually understanding what caused this conflict and all that, like what if one side is engaging in terrorism, or if this is more tit for tat violence. Some of it I know is stemming from like land conflicts, herders versus farmers, things like that, but at the same time, it's so hard to actually pin down what's happening in these attacks that I think are typically happening in more remote villages. And there's just people after that say a lot of people died, but no real reporting on who it is or why or what the long-standing conflict is. The U.S. says that it is assisting Niger in developing its Army's basic training program. The big problem here is that a lot of these armies, like the U.S. Army, has a history of a lot of human rights violations and will likely commit them in the future. And so the more the U.S. is involved in training and involved in crafting what happens in these different armies, the more we're responsible for what those armies do. And then the last story is in the very top of Cameroon, which is a part of the Sahel region of Africa, had 10 people at least killed in clashes, hundreds of people displaced. And, again, this is hard to really get into and try to figure out what's happening, other than the fact that, the violence has, from Libya, from the U.S. wars there, has spread all the way to Cameroon now, and is just wreaking havoc on this region of the world. And so really happy that I finally got to that segment. I've been meaning to do it for quite a while, to talk about this region and what's happened, not just since the U.S. war there, but over the past couple of months. Finally found a little bit of time to do it today, and boy, with what's going on in Burkina Faso and Mali and everything like that, couldn't have been a more important time to talk about it. And hopefully I'll continue to update in the future, because I do think that this violence is going to continue to get a little bit worse. All right. That's where I'm wrapping up for today. Hope everybody enjoyed the show. Share the show. Conflicts of interest. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey for video version. Hosted at the Libertarian Institute, often at the blog at antiwar.com. Buy your CBD at palomaverdecbd.com. Use the promo code PEACE to save yourself money and get the show a kickback. And I'll be back with more shows later in the week.